The morning had started with deceptive clarity. Sergeant Sarah Chen stood at the edge of the military transport, watching the Afghan mountains rise before her like ancient sentinels. Despite the early November chill, the sky had been a brilliant blue, the kind that made you forget just for a moment that you were marching toward danger. Her medical pack, carefully arranged with field instruments, tourniquets, morphine, and emergency supplies, weighed comfortably against her back. She'd been a combat medic for 4 years, deployed twice before, but that familiar flutter of pre-mission anxiety never quite went away. Captain James Morrison briefed the 12 Rangers under his command with the casual confidence of a veteran. "Reconnaissance only," he'd said, tapping a map position in the Panjshir Valley. "Intel suggests insurgent movement near the northern pass. We observe, report, and extract. Simple." Sarah knew better than to trust the word simple in combat operations, but she'd learned to compartmentalize her doubts and focus on her job, keeping these men alive if things went wrong. The patrol had hiked for 6 hours through increasingly difficult terrain. The Rangers were superb, each soldier moving with practiced efficiency, weapons ready, eyes constantly scanning the mountainside. Sarah moved with them, her role different but equally vital. She wasn't there to fight. She was there to ensure that if fighting happened, her teammates would survive it. The 6 Rangers at the front of the patrol were Private James Rodriguez, a lanky 23-year-old from Texas with a perpetually easy smile; Corporal Luis Martinez, a 10-year veteran with a wife and 3 kids waiting for him back at Fort Benning; Specialist David Thompson, the squad's sharpshooter, quiet but deadly accurate; Private Marcus Jenkins, fresh from advanced training, eager to prove himself; and 2 others whose names Sarah knew by heart from countless briefings and meals in the FOB, soldiers whose families she'd never met, but whose lives she was responsible for protecting. By midday, the weather had turned. Clouds rolled in from the north with surprising speed, darkening the sky from brilliant blue to threatening gray. The temperature dropped precipitously. Sarah noticed the wind picking up, and she'd pulled her protective layers tighter. Captain Morrison had considered turning back. She'd seen the hesitation in his eyes, but intelligence reports suggested a narrow window for this reconnaissance. If they didn't go now, the operation would be postponed another week. Morrison had made the call to push forward. That decision would haunt him for the rest of his life. The pass narrowed as they climbed higher. The rocky terrain offered few places for concealment, but Morrison distributed the Rangers in a tactical formation anyway, spreading them across the slope. Sarah moved with Private Jenkins, one of the support elements, about 60 meters behind the forward team. She could see Rodriguez ahead, his rifle scanning the ridgeline. She could see Martinez checking his equipment. They looked like soldiers at work, routine and professional. Then everything shattered. The first burst of automatic fire came from their left, from a ridgeline they should have had clear sightlines on. The insurgents had positioned themselves perfectly, high ground, concealed positions, and timing that suggested either excellent luck or excellent intelligence. Sarah heard the distinctive crack-crack-crack of AK-47s, answered immediately by the sharper reports of M4 rifles. Her training kicked in automatically. She dropped behind a boulder, pulling Jenkins down beside her. "Contact left, 200 meters," someone screamed into the radio. The firefight escalated with terrifying speed. Sarah watched Rodriguez dive behind cover, his rifle returning fire. Martinez was there too, but then he went down, not dramatically, not in the movies-like way. He simply collapsed mid-stride, and she knew immediately from the way his body moved that he'd taken rounds in the upper body. Center mass. Serious. "Man down," Jenkins yelled, but Sarah was already moving. She calculated distances in her mind, trajectory of fire and risk assessment. Rodriguez was pinned down but apparently unwounded. Thompson was returning fire with disciplined precision, his shots measured and deadly. But Martinez was out of the fight, possibly dying, and nobody else was close enough to reach him immediately. Sarah ran. It wasn't brave or heroic, it was simply what medics do. She ran in a crouch, staying as low as possible, and the fire that cracked past her seemed impossibly close. A round hit the stone near her head, sending chips of rock into her face. She didn't stop. She couldn't stop. 3 seconds later, she reached Martinez and threw herself down beside him. Blood, so much blood. His breathing was labored, and she could hear the sucking sound of a chest wound. Penetrating trauma. Her hands went to work immediately, finding the entry wound and assessing its severity. The bullet had entered just below his right shoulder, probably through both lungs if she was reading the signs correctly. "Stay with me, Lewis," she said, her voice steady despite the chaos around them. "I've got you." Even as she spoke, another ranger, Thompson, went down. His leg buckled and he fell backward, his scream cut short as shock took over. "That's two. Critical." Captain Morrison appeared beside her, his face a mask of focused intensity. "How bad?" he shouted. "Chest wound, bilateral lung involvement possible," Sarah called back. "He's critical but stable if we move him now." "Rodriguez," Morrison screamed into the radio. "Status." "I'm hit in the leg." Rodriguez's voice came back, desperate and scared. "Not sure how bad." Sarah's mind was already calculating. 3 rangers down, 2 others still in the fight, insurgent fire intensifying as more enemy positions revealed themselves. They were caught in a classic ambush, and they were losing. The blizzard, almost forgotten in the initial chaos, was intensifying. Snow began to fall heavily, reducing visibility to critical levels. Sarah could see maybe 30 meters. The temperature was dropping visibly. What had been a reconnaissance mission was transforming into a survival situation. Morrison made his decision. "Rodriguez, Jenkins, Thompson, maintain suppressive fire. Everyone else fall back to the upper position. We need higher ground." He turned to Sarah, his jaw set. "Stay here, stabilize them. We'll secure a defensive position and call for extraction." "How long?" Sarah asked, already knowing the answer would be an estimate. "Helicopters 30 minutes out if this weather clears. 2 hours maximum if we have to wait it out." 2 hours in a blizzard with 3 critical patients and limited medical supplies. Sarah processed the information with the emotional detachment that combat medics learn to cultivate. It was possible. Difficult, but possible. "I'll keep them breathing," she said. Morrison squeezed her shoulder once, a gesture of acknowledgement and apology and farewell all at once, then turned and moved toward the remaining rangers. Fall back to the ridge." Sarah watched them go, watched her unit disappear into the increasing snow and chaos, watched the man who had responsibility for all of them make the impossible choice to survive rather than die with his medic. It was tactically sound. It was the right call. It was also leaving her alone with 3 dying soldiers and a mountain that was rapidly becoming a tomb. The firing continued for another minute, then shifted as the rangers relocated to higher ground. Sarah was suddenly aware of the profound silence around her, broken only by wind, snow, the labored breathing of her patients, and the distant sound of insurgent gunfire echoing off the mountains. She was alone, completely, utterly alone. Rodriguez lay bleeding from a shattered femur. Martinez's breath came in wet, desperate gasps. Thompson was barely conscious, his leg wound serious but less immediately life-threatening than the others. And somewhere behind them, Specialist Jenkins was still pinned down, unable to fall back. Sarah pulled her pack closer and began to work. Sarah moved with the efficiency of someone whose training had become second nature. She couldn't afford panic, couldn't allow doubt to interfere with the calculated precision that separates a living patient from a dead one. The natural rock overhang provided minimal shelter, barely more than a depression in the mountainside, but it would have to suffice. It was what they had, and what they had was all that stood between her soldiers and death. She dragged Rodriguez first, using a combination of dragging and careful repositioning to move the injured ranger into the partial shelter. His screams of pain were sharp and immediate. The femur fracture was severe. She could see the bone had likely broken cleanly, but that didn't make the situation less critical. A shattered femur meant massive internal bleeding, shock, and death if she didn't act immediately. "Easy, easy," she murmured, more for herself than for him. "I've got you. Stay with me, Rodriguez." She knelt beside him and went to work. Her fingers found the trauma shears in her pack almost automatically, and she cut away his trouser leg with practiced efficiency. The injury was worse than she'd initially thought. The break was compound, bone visible through the skin in one location, blood pooling rapidly. Infection would be a concern if they survived the next few hours. Blood loss was her immediate enemy. "This is going to hurt," she said, and there was no point in lying. She positioned the tourniquet just above his knee, right at the pressure point she'd been trained on hundreds of times in countless drill scenarios. Real life was always different from training, though. Training dummy legs didn't scream. Training didn't have the weight of another human's life pressing down on your shoulders with every decision. She pulled the tourniquet tight. Rodriguez's scream could probably be heard by the insurgents if they were listening, but there was nothing she could do about that now. Stopping the bleeding was paramount. She wrapped the tourniquet 3 times around his thigh and secured it with the metal tightening mechanism. His skin turned pale above the tourniquet, then bluish as the blood supply was completely cut off. The color change was exactly what she wanted to see. "Tourniquet's on," she said quietly, as if reporting to her commanding officer rather than documenting her own work. "Hemorrhage controlled. You're going to make it, Rodriguez. I promise you that." He was too far gone into shock to respond coherently. His eyes were wide and unfocused, his breathing rapid and shallow. Sarah grabbed an emergency blanket from her pack and draped it over him, not to keep him warm, that would come later, but to slow his body's descent into deeper shock. Every small measure helped. Martinez was next, and his situation was infinitely more complex. The chest wound was the defining crisis. Sarah knelt beside him and assessed with brutal clinical precision. Entry wound just below the right shoulder, too close to the lung field. His breathing was labored, wet-sounding, which confirmed her initial fear. Blood was filling his chest cavity. This was a tension pneumothorax in the making if she didn't intervene. "Louis, can you hear me?" she asked, her voice steady and calm despite the chaos in her mind. Martinez's eyes found hers. He was conscious enough to understand what was happening, which was both good and bad. Good because she could get information from him. Bad because he was aware of the severity of his own condition. "Can't breathe," he gasped. "I know, I'm going to help you." Sarah found the entry wound and examined it carefully. Blood flowed steadily but not catastrophically. The real problem was internal. She needed to prevent fluid buildup in his chest cavity, needed to manage the airway, and needed to stabilize his breathing enough to keep him alive until advanced medical care could take over. She opened her trauma kit with careful fingers that were already growing numb from the cold, and removed the chest seal. It was a specialized dressing designed for exactly this situation, a penetrating chest wound. She cleaned the area as best she could with antiseptic wipes from her kit, applied the seal, and secured it with medical tape. The seal would allow air to escape during exhalation, but prevent air from entering during inhalation, preventing the pressure buildup that would collapse his lung completely. "Chest seal applied," she reported to herself, maintaining that clinical detachment. "Breathing should improve." Martinez's respiration did ease slightly. It wasn't the dramatic improvement of movies and television, but it was measurable, real, and precious. She covered him with an emergency blanket and moved to Thompson. Thompson was conscious and in terrible pain from his leg wound. The bullet had entered just below the knee and appeared to have exited on the other side, a through-and-through that had probably damaged the tibia and possibly the fibula. Not immediately life-threatening like the other two, but serious nonetheless. She applied a pressure bandage, wrapped the wound securely with medical gauze, and administered a morphine injection despite her limited supply. "You're the lucky one," she told Thompson and meant it. "You're going to hurt like hell, but you're going to live." By now, nearly 30 minutes had passed since Morrison had retreated with the mobile Rangers. The blizzard was intensifying dramatically. The wind had picked up to near gale force, and the snow was falling so thickly that she could barely see 5 meters in any direction. Temperature was dropping. Sarah could see her own breath condensing in front of her face, and she knew that hypothermia was already beginning to threaten her patients. She pulled out her radio. "Command, this is Medic 1 at the ambush site. 3 critical patients stabilized. Rodriguez has open femur fracture. Martinez has chest wound with probable lung involvement. Thompson has lower leg trauma. Status on extraction." The radio crackled for a long moment before Captain Morrison's voice came through, and Sarah could hear the strain in his words. "Medic 1, this is 6 actual. Helicopter is currently grounded due to weather. Visibility is near 0. They're standing by, but earliest extraction window is now. 2 hours, possibly longer." 2 hours in a blizzard, with 3 critical patients. Sarah closed her eyes for just a moment, allowing herself 1 second of the fear and doubt that she couldn't afford to show to her soldiers. "Copy that, 6. I'll keep them stable. We'll be ready when you are." "Medic 1, you've done good work. Hang tight." The radio went silent. Sarah looked at her 3 patients, their bodies arranged in the shallow shelter, covered in emergency blankets that did almost nothing against the advancing cold. Martinez's breathing was shallow but steady. Rodriguez was unconscious from shock, which was probably a mercy. Thompson was shivering violently, his teeth chattering so hard she worried he might crack them. She pulled off her outer jacket and used it to provide additional insulation, layering it over the emergency blankets. She would be colder now, but if one of her patients died from hypothermia while she had unused thermal resources, she would never forgive herself. The wind howled around the rock overhang. The temperature continued to drop. Sarah sat in the center of her 3 soldiers, monitoring their vital signs by touch and sound, talking to them constantly to keep them from slipping into the final darkness of shock. "You're Rangers," she said quietly, more to convince herself than them. "The toughest soldiers in the army, and you don't give up. Neither do I. 2 hours. We've got this. We're going to make it." But as midnight approached and the blizzard raged with undiminished fury, Sarah began to understand that 2 hours might not be enough. She looked at Martinez, whose breathing seemed more labored now, and made a decision that would change everything. They weren't going to survive waiting for rescue. They were going to have to move. Midnight came like a funeral bell. Sarah sat beside Corporal Martinez, her gloved hand resting on his wrist, counting his pulse for the 100th time that night. 112 beats per minute. Too fast. His breathing had become shallower despite the chest seal, more labored, more desperate. The wet rattling sound in his lungs had worsened. Blood was accumulating somewhere inside his chest cavity despite her best efforts, and there was nothing she could do about it with the tools she had. He was dying. All 3 of them were dying, just at different speeds. Rodriguez's tourniquet had been in place for nearly 6 hours now. The leg below the tourniquet was turning a mottled purple-gray color that made Sarah's stomach turn. Compartment syndrome was almost certainly developing. He would need surgical intervention within the next few hours or face permanent damage, amputation, or death from rhabdomyolysis when toxins from the dying muscle tissue entered his bloodstream. Thompson's shivering had intensified to violent, uncontrollable convulsions. She'd layered every piece of insulation she could find over him, but the shelter was a refrigerator, and the blizzard showed no signs of relenting. His core temperature was dropping. Hypothermia was winning. Sarah pulled out her radio one more time. 6 actual, this is Medic 1. Status on extraction. The delay in response told her everything she needed to know before Morrison's voice came through, tight with frustration. Medic 1 helicopter is still grounded. Visibility is approximately 50 meters. Ceiling is too low. They're requesting another 2 hours minimum, possibly longer. 2 more hours, maybe more. Sarah did the math in her head, the calculation she'd been avoiding since the radio call that had delayed extraction the first time. Martinez wouldn't last 2 more hours. Not with that breathing pattern, not with that pulse. His body was failing, systems shutting down one by one, defeated by trauma and blood loss and the relentless cold. She thought about his family. He'd shown her pictures once in the fob, his wife Maria, wearing a sundress in a photo taken at some family celebration. His 3 children, ages 5, 7, and 9. He talked about them constantly, about how he was saving for his daughter's quinceañera, about how his oldest son wanted to join the military just like his dad. That family was waiting for him, and he was going to die in a frozen shelter on a mountain in Afghanistan unless she did something impossible. Sarah stood up and the decision crystallized in her mind with absolute clarity. It wasn't even a choice, really. It was simply an understanding of what had to happen. She would not sit here and watch them die. She would not play the role of passive witness to catastrophe. If rescue wouldn't come to them, then they would move toward rescue. She had no idea if it was possible, no idea if they would survive, but she knew with certainty that if they stayed here, all 3 of them would be dead by dawn. "I'm moving you," she said aloud to her patients, as if announcing a decision to a staff meeting rather than declaring something that violated every safety protocol she'd been taught. "All of you, we're going to the fire base. 8 miles. We're going to walk it." Thompson's eyes, glazed with hypothermia, focused slightly. "You're insane." "Probably," Sarah agreed, "but insane beats dead." She needed help. The realization came quickly. She couldn't move 4 injured soldiers alone, not through a blizzard, not across 8 miles of mountain terrain. She keyed her radio. "6 actual, I need Jenkins. Can you send him back to my position?" A pause, then, "Medic 1, Jenkins is wounded. He's barely mobile." "I know, I need him anyway, send him." 30 minutes later, Private Marcus Jenkins stumbled into the shelter, his left shoulder bandaged, and his face pale with pain and cold. He was one of the few Rangers who'd managed to fall back with the main group during the retreat. A round had grazed his shoulder, painful but not disabling. He was the most physically capable soldier Sarah had available. "Jenkins, I need you to listen carefully," Sarah said without preamble. "We're going to move the 3 critical patients to the fire base. I know it's insane. I know it probably won't work. But if we stay here, they die tonight. If we move, we have a chance. A small chance, but a chance." Jenkins was silent for a long moment, staring at her like she'd suggested they grow wings and fly off the mountain. Then he looked at Martinez, at Rodriguez, at Thompson, and back to Sarah. "What do you need?" he asked. They worked together through the night, improvising with the discipline of soldiers who understood that their actions determined whether their comrades lived or died. Using paracord from emergency kits and sections of their tactical gear, they fashioned makeshift stretchers from insulation blankets. They tied Rodriguez to one stretcher, securing his body so the tourniquet-bound leg wouldn't shift and tear open further. Martinez they placed on a second stretcher, positioning him at an angle to facilitate breathing and minimize pressure on his chest wound. Thompson was the most mobile. His leg was bad, but he could potentially walk with support, though the pain would be extraordinary. Sarah gave him the last of her high-dose morphine, understanding she was gambling with his life. Too much pain, and his body would go into deeper shock. Too much morphine, and he wouldn't stay awake enough to walk at all. She calculated the dosage down to the milligram and injected it into his IV line. "Can you walk?" she asked him. Thompson's eyes were glassy from pain and drugs. "I can try." "That's all anyone can do." Sarah assembled her medical kit, repacking the essentials. Tourniquets, pressure bandages, morphine, chest seals, emergency blankets. Everything else she left behind. She couldn't carry it. She could only carry what kept people alive. Jenkins stared at the stretchers, then at the blizzard raging outside their shelter. "We're 8 miles from the fire base, in this weather in the dark, carrying wounded." "I know," Sarah said quietly. "It might be impossible, but staying here is definitely impossible. At least this way, we're moving toward life instead of waiting for death." She looked at each of her soldiers, these men she'd trained with, eaten with, known in the particular way soldiers know each other. She had made a promise when she'd become a medic, a promise to never abandon them, to always be there, to always try. "We move in 5 minutes," she said. "I want each of you to remember something. Rangers lead the way. That's your motto. Well, we're leading the way tonight. We're going to walk through this blizzard and we're going to get to that fire base and we're going to survive this. Because medics don't leave their people behind, and soldiers don't surrender to the cold." Jenkins nodded slowly, and Sarah saw something shift in his eyes. Acceptance, determination, and the particular courage that comes from following someone who's willing to walk into hell and bring you back alive. Sarah marked their location with a signal panel, left their radio frequency on a note, and shouldered the weight of one stretcher. Jenkins took the other. Thompson limped toward the entrance of the shelter, his arm around Sarah's shoulder. The blizzard awaited them, absolute and unforgiving. But so did the possibility of survival. Sarah took one last look at the shelter that had been their sanctuary, and stepped out into the white darkness. There was no turning back now. The first mile was a nightmare rendered in white and black. Sarah had imagined many scenarios in her career as a combat medic, had trained for countless emergencies, but nothing had prepared her for the reality of moving 4 wounded soldiers through a mountain blizzard in near-total darkness. The wind didn't just blow, it attacked with physical force, trying to knock them off their feet at every step. The snow fell so thickly that the beam of her tactical flashlight disappeared into white nothingness after just a few feet, making navigation almost impossible. She and Jenkins took turns carrying the stretchers, 30 minutes at a time before exhaustion forced a switch. Even 30 minutes felt like an eternity. Sarah's shoulders screamed in protest as she bore Rodriguez's weight, the stretcher's handles biting into her palms through her gloves. Her core temperature was dropping despite the exertion of movement. Exertion in extreme cold was a dangerous game. Move too hard and you sweat, which then freezes against your skin and accelerates heat loss. Move too slowly, and hypothermia wins from lack of metabolic heat generation. It was a mathematical equation with no good answer. Thompson limped beside her, his arm across her shoulders, his breathing coming in desperate gasps. The morphine had taken the edge off his pain but not eliminated it. His leg was a screaming nightmare every time he put weight on it, and she could feel him weakening with every 100 meters. His body was hemorrhaging heat, his core temperature dropping despite the heavy layers, his mind beginning to show the subtle signs of hypothermia, confusion, lethargy, slurred speech. "Stay with me, Thompson," she said, more to keep him awake than because she expected a coherent response. "Tell me about home. Where are you from?" "Missouri," Thompson slurred. "St. Louis, my mom makes the best apple pie." "Apple pie sounds good right now," Sarah agreed, keeping her voice steady and engaging. She knew what she was doing, using conversation to fight the seductive pull of sleep that hypothermia whispered. Stay conscious. Stay talking. Stay alive. Jenkins was falling apart in ways he was trying to hide. His shoulder wound had started bleeding again during their first 20 minutes of movement, and Sarah could see the dark stain spreading across his bandage. He was compensating by favoring his other shoulder, which meant he was moving in a twisted, inefficient manner that would exhaust him faster. But he didn't complain. He just kept moving, kept carrying Martinez's stretcher, kept doing the impossible thing that needed to be done. By the second mile, they had entered what Sarah privately thought of as the danger zone. Exhaustion was setting in. Thompson was becoming increasingly confused, at one point asking why they were walking in the parking lot when they should be in the hospital. Rodriguez had regained consciousness but was in the grip of severe shock. His eyes were wide and unseeing, his skin mottled and cold despite the blankets. Martinez's breathing had stabilized somewhat, but only because he'd slipped into a kind of semi-conscious delirium. Sarah's own body was failing. She couldn't feel her toes anymore. Her fingers had gone numb hours ago. Her face was so cold that she could barely move her jaw to speak. When she breathed, the cold air felt like knives in her lungs. She was shaking constantly, the uncontrollable shivering of advancing hypothermia, though she tried to hide it from Jenkins and Thompson. She was singing to stay awake. Ranger cadences, pop songs from her teenage years, military marching songs, anything to keep her mind engaged, to keep the seductive darkness of sleep from pulling her under. We march through day and we march through night, and the Ranger standard says we do it right, she sang, her voice hoarse from cold and exhaustion. Thompson was hallucinating. He kept asking about his sergeant, insisting they were late for formation, trying to walk faster despite the catastrophic injury to his leg. Sarah had to physically restrain him at one point, holding him in place while she checked his vital signs. His pulse was racing, his breathing rapid and shallow. Every system in his body was failing, trying to maintain core temperature by restricting blood flow to his extremities. During the 3rd mile, Jenkins nearly fell into a crevasse he hadn't seen hidden under the snow. Sarah grabbed him, jerked him backward, felt the stretcher with Martinez's weight on it nearly tip into the darkness below. For a moment, they stood at the edge, and Sarah had a vivid image of losing her patient to a fall while trying to save him. "Watch the terrain," she snapped, adrenaline spiking her alertness back up. "Eyes front, we're almost there." She had no idea if that was true. She had no idea how much farther the fire base was. The blizzard had disoriented them, and she couldn't check her GPS. Her hands were too numb to operate it. She was navigating by dead reckoning, by half-remembered map orientations, by pure stubborn will. Rodriguez began seizing. Sarah realized it when she heard the distinctive sound of his body convulsing on the stretcher she was carrying. She immediately set the stretcher down carefully and checked him. Seizure activity from shock, from the trauma, from his body's desperate attempt to survive. She positioned him on his side, cleared his airway, and waited for it to pass. Jenkins was beside her, holding Martinez's stretcher in one hand and steadying Rodriguez with the other. "Is he dying?" Jenkins asked, and she heard the break in his voice. "Not yet," Sarah said. "Not on my watch." The seizure passed. Rodriguez's body went limp, consciousness fading. Sarah checked his airway again, confirmed he was breathing, and they continued. The 4th mile was where Sarah realized she was also failing. Her mind was becoming strange, disconnected. At one point she was certain her drill sergeant was walking beside her, evaluating her performance. She almost laughed at that. What would her drill sergeant think of this operation? Complete failure to follow protocols, abandoning a defensive position, moving critical patients in impossible conditions. Insane, but also the only option. Her legs were moving mechanically now, her feet finding purchase on the snow-covered ground through muscle memory rather than conscious thought. She was singing again, but she couldn't hear her own voice anymore. Everything was muffled, distant, like she was operating through a thick fog. Time became meaningless. Had they been walking for 3 hours, 6 hours? She had no reference point anymore. There was only the next step, the next breath, the next moment of keeping 5 people alive. Then, through the blizzard, she saw something that might have been imagination or might have been reality. A light, a faint yellow glow in the darkness. Sarah stopped, blinked. The light was still there. "Jenkins," she called, her voice barely audible. "Do you see that?" Jenkins turned and his face transformed. That's got to be the fire base. That's electric light, that's." "We're going to make it," Sarah said, and the words felt like a prayer and a promise all at once. But even as hope bloomed, she realized that Thompson had stopped walking beside her. He was still in her grip, but his weight had changed. His body had gone completely limp. She checked for a pulse while maintaining her forward momentum. It was still there, weak but there. Thompson had lost consciousness, but he was still breathing. Sarah adjusted her grip and kept walking toward the light. The research station materialized from the blizzard like a ghost, like an answer to a prayer that Sarah wasn't entirely sure she believed in anymore. The structure was deteriorating. Rust streaked the corrugated metal walls, and the windows were either missing or covered in years of accumulated grime. But it was standing. It was shelter. It was survival. Sarah's legs nearly gave out as she approached the entrance. Jenkins was beside her, virtually carrying Thompson now, their bodies moving in synchronization born from hours of shared struggle. The stretchers with Rodriguez and Martinez felt impossibly heavy, as if they'd accumulated weight with every mile traveled. Sarah's mind was barely functional. She was operating on instinct and muscle memory, the part of her that was trained to push beyond human limits. The door was locked. Sarah stared at it with a rage that cut through her hypothermia-induced fog. Of all the cruelties the mountain could inflict, this seemed particularly vicious. They were here. They'd made the impossible journey, and now a locked door stood between them and shelter. Jenkins set down his stretcher carefully and pulled his sidearm. "I can shoot the lock," he said, his voice hoarse and barely recognizable. Sarah shook her head. "Try the handle again. Military installations sometimes have." But Jenkins was already applying pressure to the door frame, and the wood, weakened by years of mountain weather and neglect, splintered. The lock gave way with surprisingly little resistance. The door swung inward, and immediately the four of them were pulled inside by the relative absence of wind. The interior was freezing, but it was a different kind of cold, still below freezing but without the violent assault of the blizzard. The research station appeared to have been abandoned for years. The equipment was old, covered in dust and largely non-functional. But there was a fireplace, a concrete floor, and walls that actually blocked the wind. "Get them inside," Sarah commanded, and Jenkins immediately began carefully maneuvering Rodriguez's stretcher through the doorway. Sarah moved methodically through the station, assessing what they had to work with. The main room was spacious enough to accommodate all of them. There was broken furniture they could use for fuel. There were old blankets, stiff with age but still better than nothing. And then, in what appeared to have been an office, she found something that made her heart stutter: a fireplace with a partial cord of wood stacked beside it. Whoever had abandoned this station years ago had left behind the means for survival. Jenkins had managed to get all three stretcher-bound patients inside and arranged them in the main room away from the doorway. Thompson was still unconscious, his breathing shallow. Rodriguez was awake now but delirious, muttering about things that made no sense. Martinez was the same, caught in that twilight between consciousness and oblivion, his body operating on the minimal brain activity necessary to maintain vital functions. Sarah began building a fire with the methodical precision of someone performing one of the most critical tasks of her life. She cleared the fireplace of debris, arranged the wood carefully, and used her lighter, mercifully still functional, to get a flame going. Within minutes, actual heat was radiating into the room. The temperature inside the station began to rise almost immediately. Sarah felt her own shaking begin to increase rather than decrease, a sign that her body was finally starting to rewarm and that her nervous system was beginning to register the damage the cold had inflicted. She had severe frostbite on her fingers and toes, she realized distantly. First degree, probably second degree, but she wasn't dead. None of them were dead. "Check the patients," she told Jenkins, who was slumped against the wall, the color slowly returning to his face. "Tell me their status while I assess the shelter." She conducted a systematic search of the station while Jenkins reported in. Rodriguez's tourniquet was still secure, still doing its job, but the tissue below was increasingly compromised. Martinez's chest seal was intact. Thompson's leg wound wasn't showing fresh bleeding, which meant the initial hemorrhage had already run its course. A horrifying thought, but accurate. In what appeared to be a storage room, Sarah found something miraculous: A small electric radio on a shelf, next to a solar charger and 3 backup batteries. The equipment looked old but potentially functional. Her hands were shaking so badly she could barely manipulate the on switch, but she managed it. The radio crackled to life, and for a moment there was only static. She adjusted the frequency, searching for military bands. Nothing. She tried another frequency, then another. Still nothing but static and the occasional fragment of something that might have been a voice. Then, on the third frequency adjustment, she heard it. Weather update for the region, visibility improving to the south, civilian rescue operations. Sarah keyed the transmit button. This is Army medical personnel with 4 critical patients at the abandoned research station near grid reference. She had to think for a moment, her brain moving slowly. She provided the grid reference as best she could recall. We need immediate medical evacuation. 1 patient with tension pneumothorax, 1 with compound femur fracture requiring tourniquet, 1 with severe leg trauma and possible compartment syndrome, and 1 with severe hypothermia. There was a pause, then, say again, do you have military radio frequency? Negative, using civilian research station radio. Can you relay to military command? Who is this? Sergeant Sarah Chen, Army combat medic. I have 3 Rangers requiring immediate advanced medical care. Patient status is critical but stable. We can hold position for. She glanced at Thompson's unconscious form, at Martinez's labored breathing. Approximately 4 to 6 hours before deterioration becomes irreversible. Stand by, Sergeant. I'm relaying your position to search and rescue. They're aware of a downed Ranger patrol. Are there 4 patients? 5 personnel total. 1 medic, 3 critical patients, 1 lightly wounded support personnel. We walked out of the blizzard from the ambush site. The civilian radio operator's voice carried unmistakable shock. You walked 4 wounded soldiers through that blizzard. We had to, Sarah said simply. They would have died if we waited. What felt like forever, but was probably only minutes passed before a new voice came through the radio, military frequency, slightly distorted but unmistakably official. Sergeant Chen, this is Major Patterson with the Regional Command Center. We have you on our map. Helicopter is being prepared now. Weather is clearing in your area. Estimated arrival time is 90 minutes. 90 minutes, not forever, not impossible, just 90 minutes. Sarah sat down heavily beside the fire, and only then did she allow herself to truly process what they'd accomplished. They'd covered approximately 8 miles through a mountain blizzard in near-total darkness. They'd moved 3 critical patients and 1 lightly wounded soldier. They'd maintained vital functions in conditions designed to kill. And they'd done it. She checked each patient again, now with the knowledge that rescue was actually coming. Martinez's breathing was still labored but stable. Rodriguez had regained slightly more consciousness. Thompson's pulse was weak but steady. Jenkins had finally allowed himself to rest, his back against the wall, his wounded shoulder showing through the torn fabric of his uniform. We made it, Jenkins whispered, as if he couldn't quite believe it. We made it, Sarah confirmed. She would spend the next 90 minutes ensuring that all of her patients stayed alive long enough for the helicopter to arrive. She would monitor vital signs obsessively, adjust positions to facilitate breathing, watch for any sign of deterioration. She would be professional and clinical and absolutely unwilling to lose anyone at the moment victory was finally within reach. But in the quiet moments, while the fire burned and the wind still howled outside, Sarah allowed herself to recognize what they'd accomplished. Not because it was heroic, it was simply necessary, but because against impossible odds, with nothing but determination and training and refusal to quit, they had survived. And that meant the Rangers would survive too. The sound came first, the distinctive thud-thud-thud of helicopter rotors cutting through the mountain air. Sarah heard it while monitoring Martinez's pulse, and her head snapped up. Jenkins, who had been dozing beside the fire, immediately came alert. "They're here," Jenkins breathed, and there was wonder in his voice, as if he still couldn't quite believe rescue was possible. Sarah moved to the station's window and looked out. Through the clearing blizzard, she could see the helicopter descending through the clouds, its spotlight cutting through the remaining snow. The sight of it, black and massive and impossibly real, made something catch in her throat. "Get them ready to move," she told Jenkins. "They're landing." The next 10 minutes were a blur of activity. Sarah conducted a final assessment of each patient, checking bandages, taking last vital signs, preparing them for transport. Her hands were shaking, whether from cold, exhaustion, or adrenaline she couldn't tell, probably all three. Martinez's breathing had actually improved in the shelter. His oxygen saturation, checked with the pulse oximeter from her medical kit, was holding at acceptable levels. His pulse was still elevated but stable. The chest seal was intact. He was ready for transport, though still critical. Rodriguez's tourniquet had been in place for over 12 hours, now dangerous territory. The tissue below was irreversibly damaged, but his vital signs were holding. The tourniquet was doing its job, preventing catastrophic hemorrhage. He would need amputation surgery, almost certainly, but he would survive to have it. Thompson had regained partial consciousness in the warmth of the station. His core temperature was still dangerously low, but his vital signs had stabilized enough that he was no longer immediately life-threatening. His leg wound was clean and bandaged. He could be moved. The helicopter touched down in a clearing just outside the station, and within seconds, the rotors began to slow. Sarah watched as the side door opened and personnel emerged, a flight medic in full tactical gear, followed by 3 paramedics carrying evacuation equipment. She went to the door and met them as they approached. The flight medic, a captain with TORRES on his name tape, took one look at her, and his eyes widened slightly. "Sergeant Chen?" he asked. "That's me," Sarah confirmed. Torres stared at her for a moment, and Sarah realized what he was seeing. A woman covered in blood and snow, her face frostbitten, her uniform torn and filthy, her eyes carrying the particular exhaustion of someone who'd pushed past every human limit. She probably looked like she'd barely survived, which wasn't far from the truth. "Major Patterson said you walked 4 wounded soldiers through a blizzard," Torres said. "3 critical, 1 lightly wounded," Sarah corrected. "All ambulatory or carrying ready." Torres nodded, and his team immediately sprang into motion. They brought in evacuation stretchers and began the careful process of moving Sarah's patients onto equipment designed specifically for transport. Torres himself worked beside her, and she could see the respect in his movements. He was treating her patients with the same care he would show any critical evacuation. "Martinez is priority," Sarah said, pointing. "Chest wound with probable pneumothorax and internal bleeding. I've got a chest seal in place. Breathing has stabilized but remains labored. Heart rate is elevated but holding. He needs advanced trauma care now." Torres examined the chest seal with a nod of approval. "Good work," Field applied. "Yes, approximately 8 hours ago." "It held," Torres said simply. "That's impressive." The paramedics were moving with practiced efficiency. One was establishing an IV line on Martinez, a second line, giving him additional access for fluids and medications. Another was securing Rodriguez onto the evacuation stretcher, carefully protecting the leg with the tourniquet. "Rodriguez has a compound femur fracture with tourniquet in place since the ambush," Sarah briefed. 12+ hours of tourniquet time. Tissue below is compromised but not actively hemorrhaging. He's stable." "Amputation candidate?" Torres asked. "Almost certainly, but he'll live." Thompson was the last, and he was actually conscious enough to speak, though his words were slurred from residual hypothermia and shock. "You did it, medic," he said to Sarah. "You actually did it." "We did it," Sarah corrected. "Jenkins did half the heavy lifting." Jenkins stood to the side, watching the evacuation with the peculiar stillness of someone who'd finally allowed himself to accept that survival was real. His shoulder wound had been reassessed by one of the paramedics and deemed non-critical, but one of them had rebandaged it and given him pain medication. 4 patients, Torres asked, counting. 3 critical, 1 support personnel with non-critical shoulder wound, Sarah said. Jenkins was invaluable in getting us here. He needs medical evaluation, but he's stable. Torres made a note and spoke into his radio. Command, we have 4 medical casualties and 1 support personnel. 3 critical, 1 non-critical, 1 medic. Ready for immediate evacuation of critical patients. Roger that, came the response. Proceed with priority evacuation. The paramedics were moving Martinez toward the helicopter first, his stretcher secured carefully. Sarah watched them go, her mind tracking his vital signs, his oxygen status, everything that needed to happen in the next hours for him to survive. Go with him, Torres said to her. You're the primary medic on this case. He needs your continuity of care. Sarah nodded, but she turned to Rodriguez first. Rodriguez, you're next. You're going to surgery. You're going to lose your leg, but you're going to live. And you're going to get to see your family again. That's what matters. Rodriguez, semi-conscious, gripped her hand with surprising strength. Thank you, he whispered. That's what medics do, Sarah replied. Thompson was last, and he was conscious enough to understand what was happening. Sergeant Chen, he said as they lifted his stretcher. That was the craziest thing I've ever seen. We shouldn't have survived that. Well, we did, Sarah said, so don't waste it, go live. Torres was waiting to help her to the helicopter. She was moving on pure adrenaline now, and she realized her legs were barely functional. Torres caught her when she stumbled and half carried her toward the aircraft. How long since you've slept? He asked. Don't know, Sarah admitted. 24 hours more. You held 3 critical patients stable through a mountain blizzard and an 8-mile carry, Torres said as they reached the helicopter. You can rest now. But Sarah didn't rest. She moved immediately to Martinez's side in the helicopter, monitoring his vital signs, working with Torres to adjust medications, watching his chest rise and fall. The helicopter lifted off, and through the open side door, Sarah could see the research station receding below them, and beyond it, the blizzard-covered mountains where she'd made the impossible journey. They'd made it, all of them. They'd survived. The helicopter banked toward the military medical facility, and Sarah finally allowed herself to exhale. Her patients were alive. They were receiving advanced care. They were going to make it. She looked at Torres and saw him looking back at her with something that might have been awe. Sergeant Chen, he said quietly, what you did today, that's going to be remembered. Sarah shook her head. I just did my job. No, Torres said, you did something more than that. But Sarah wasn't thinking about legacy or heroism. She was thinking about Martinez breathing easier, Rodriguez's vital signs stabilizing, Thompson finally getting advanced care, Jenkins getting his shoulder properly evaluated. They had survived, and that was enough. The military hospital at Bagram was a controlled chaos of recovery and rehabilitation. 3 weeks after the rescue, Sarah moved between rooms with the obsessive precision of someone who couldn't quite believe her patients had actually survived. She was supposed to be resting, recuperating from severe frostbite and hypothermia, but the medical personnel had learned not to expect compliance from a medic whose soldiers were still fighting for their lives. Corporal Martinez occupied a room in intensive care, and Sarah spent at least 2 hours there every day. His chest wound had required surgery to remove the damaged lung tissue, but the remaining lung function was adequate. He'd survived the initial critical period and was now in the long, painful process of recovery. His wife Maria had arrived from the States 3 days ago, and Sarah had watched them reunite with tears streaming down both their faces. Maria had pulled Sarah aside and held her for a long time without speaking, a gratitude too profound for words. He kept saying your name, Maria had told her. In the helicopter in recovery during the nightmares. Sarah's got me. Sarah won't let me die. He held on because he believed in you. Private Rodriguez was in a completely different battle. His leg had been amputated just below the knee, a surgical decision made necessary by the tissue damage from the tourniquet and the compartment syndrome that had developed. Sarah had been present when they told him, had watched his face crumble, then harden with the particular determination that soldiers develop when confronted with permanent disability. But he was alive. He would walk again with a prosthetic. He would see his family. He would get to that quinceañera his daughter was planning. I'm going to PT hell, Rodriguez had told Sarah with a weak smile. But I'm going to PT hell walking out of here, not being wheeled out. That's what you taught me. Specialist Thompson was the fastest to recover. His leg wound was severe but clean, and hypothermia treatment had been more straightforward than Martinez's trauma. He was already in physical therapy, already pushing himself with the aggressive determination of a young soldier determined to return to duty. He'd asked Sarah about re-enlisting, about whether she thought he could get back to the Rangers. With work maybe, Sarah had told him honestly. Your leg will be strong again. What matters is what you do with it. Private Jenkins had been released after 5 days, his shoulder wound deemed non-critical. But he came back to the hospital every single day, visiting his brothers, sitting with Sarah during her medical appointments. The wound on his shoulder was healing well, but Sarah recognized the deeper wounds, the psychological scars of facing his own mortality and being forced to accept help rather than always being the helper. The formal investigation into Captain Morrison's decision to retreat and leave Sarah with the wounded had concluded 3 weeks after the rescue. Sarah had been called to testify, and she'd stated clearly and unequivocally that Morrison's decision had been tactically sound, and that his choice to secure higher ground and establish defensive positions had likely saved the Rangers who remained mobile. She'd testified that she'd made the decision to move her patients independently, without orders, acting on her assessment that waiting for rescue meant certain death. The investigation cleared Morrison of any wrongdoing, but it also did something more. It validated Sarah's decision to move against protocol, to trust her medical judgment over standing orders, to take responsibility for her patients' lives in a way that transcended the normal chain of command. The commendations had been unexpected but overwhelming. The Army had declared her actions exemplary. She was promoted to staff sergeant. She was awarded the Bronze Star for valor. There was talk of further recognition, of media attention, of her story being shared as an example of military excellence. Sarah found it all deeply uncomfortable. She was giving a statement to a journalist in the hospital cafeteria when Martinez's wife found her. Maria was carrying a small gift, a framed photograph of the Martinez family, taken before deployment. Louis wanted you to have this, Maria said. He said to tell you that you gave him the chance to come home to us. That's not something you can repay, but he wants you to know. Sarah took the photograph with trembling hands. In it, Louis stood with his 3 children and Maria, all of them smiling, all of them alive because Sarah had refused to accept that they would die in a frozen shelter. I just did my job, Sarah said quietly. No, Maria said firmly. You did something more. You loved my husband enough to face the impossible for him. After Maria left, Sarah sat alone in the cafeteria and finally allowed herself to cry. The tears came from exhaustion, from the release of terror she'd been suppressing, from the weight of responsibility she'd carried and would carry for the rest of her life. A hand appeared on her shoulder, and Sarah looked up to find Colonel Harrison, the base commander. He sat down across from her without asking permission. Sergeant Chen, he said, I wanted to speak with you privately, away from the media and the official channels. Sarah straightened, unsure what to expect. What you did out there was extraordinary, Harrison continued. But I know that's not what you want to hear. What you want to hear is that your soldiers are going to be okay. Are they? Sarah asked, needing validation from someone in authority. Martinez will recover. He'll never be the soldier he was, but he'll have a life. Rodriguez is adjusting to his new reality, but he's doing it with the help of your belief in his future. Thompson is going to be fine. Jenkins is processing trauma like any soldier who's faced death and lived. And you, Harrison paused, you're going to carry this for the rest of your life. The weight of their survival, the knowledge of what you sacrificed to save them. Sarah nodded, understanding that he was articulating something she'd been feeling but unable to express. That's the real price of what you did, Harrison said. Not the medals or the recognition. It's the permanent knowledge that you're responsible for 4 lives and they know it, and you'll all feel that connection forever. I don't regret it, Sarah said. I know, Harrison replied. That's what makes you a good medic. That's what makes you a leader. In the weeks that followed, the hospital became a strange intersection point for Sarah and her soldiers. Rodriguez began his prosthetic training, and Sarah attended every session, watching him struggle and persist. Martinez worked through pain management and pulmonary rehabilitation. Thompson pushed himself in physical therapy. Jenkins worked through PTSD counseling while also helping Martinez with recovery. And Sarah was there for all of it, not as their medic anymore, but as something deeper. A person who'd stood in the blizzard with them and chosen to move forward rather than accept defeat. One evening, all 4 of them were in Martinez's room. Martinez still tethered to machines but growing stronger. Rodriguez in a wheelchair with his prosthetic leg resting beside him. Thompson limping but mobile. Jenkins moving with the ease of someone whose shoulder was healing well. You know, Rodriguez said, if someone had told me that getting shot, getting tourniquet-bound for 12 hours, and losing my leg was going to be the best thing that happened to me, I would have thought they were insane. Language, Rodriguez, Sarah said automatically. But it meant I got to meet you, Rodriguez continued. All of us got to meet you, and we got to learn that the human spirit is stronger than a blizzard, than a mountain, than anything nature can throw at us. You're getting philosophical in your old age, Thompson joked. Shut up, Thompson, Rodriguez said without heat. I'm making a point. Sarah smiled despite herself. This was recovery, not just the physical healing, but the psychological knitting together of trauma and survival, and the understanding that they'd all crossed into a different category of human experience. They had survived the unsurvivable, and now they had to figure out how to live with that knowledge. 6 months after the blizzard, the formal ceremony took place in the Fort Benning Auditorium. The military had organized it meticulously, official recognition of exceptional valor, commendations, and the formal reassignment of personnel who had experienced trauma that transcended normal combat operations. Sarah sat in the front row in dress uniform, her bronze star already pinned to her chest. She was uncomfortable with the formality, uncomfortable with the cameras, uncomfortable with being the center of attention. But she was here for her soldiers, and they had asked her to be present. Captain James Morrison sat beside her, his uniform immaculate, his face carrying the particular exhaustion of a man who'd replayed his decisions 1,000 times. The investigation had cleared him, but Sarah knew from conversations with him that he would never fully forgive himself for the choice to retreat and leave her behind. That was the burden of command, living with decisions that saved some lives by risking others. Thank you, he told her during their last conversation, for not dying, for not letting them die, for being exactly the kind of soldier that makes the army function. Sarah had simply nodded, understanding that gratitude expressed by officers carried the weight of chain of command and responsibility. The ceremony began with the commanding general providing context, the ambush, the blizzard, the impossible rescue. He recounted the facts with military precision, but his voice carried emotion. This was not a routine ceremony. This was recognition of something genuinely extraordinary. Then came the personal testimonies. Corporal Luis Martinez was wheeled to the microphone. He was still recovering, still dealing with lung capacity issues, still experiencing pain from his surgery, but his presence was powerful. He gripped the microphone and looked directly at Sarah. "I died in that blizzard," Martinez said simply. "My lungs were failing. My blood pressure was dropping. I was aware of it happening, and I knew I was saying goodbye. And then Sergeant Chen made a decision that violated every protocol, that defied every standard operating procedure, that had maybe a 1% chance of working. She decided that we would walk out of that mountain. And she made that walk possible by sheer force of will and refusal to accept that we would die." Martinez's voice broke slightly. "I'm here because she carried me. I get to see my family because she made an impossible choice. And I will spend the rest of my life understanding that my existence is a gift earned by her sacrifice." Private Rodriguez was next. He was standing now, with his prosthetic leg that had been fitted just weeks earlier. The walking was still awkward, still required concentration, but he was standing. He looked at the assembled crowd and then at Sarah. "I lost my leg," Rodriguez said without preamble, "and I would lose both legs if it meant I got the same chance at survival that Sergeant Chen gave me. Because yes, I'm an amputee, but I'm alive. I'm going to my daughter's quinceañera. I'm going to walk her down the aisle at her wedding someday. And none of that happens if Sergeant Chen had accepted the conventional wisdom that we were going to die in that shelter." Rodriguez paused, and his voice became quieter, more personal. "She taught me that survival isn't about luck. It's about refusing to quit. It's about understanding that the human spirit is stronger than any circumstance. I'm going back to college. I'm going to be a teacher. And every single student I teach is going to know about a medic who carried 4 wounded soldiers through a blizzard. That's her legacy in me." Specialist Thompson walked to the microphone with barely a limp. His recovery had been the fastest, his physical healing nearly complete. "Sergeant Chen is the toughest person I've ever met," Thompson said bluntly. "She was hypothermic, she was frostbitten, she was operating on no sleep in conditions designed to kill. And she never once suggested that saving us was optional, never once implied that she might leave us behind. I've been through Army training. I've done hardened courses. And nothing prepared me for the experience of knowing that one person's will to live and keep others alive was literally the only thing standing between me and death." Thompson's hands gripped the microphone tightly. "I'm staying in the Army. I'm going to make it a career. And I'm doing it because I want to spend my life being the kind of soldier that Sergeant Chen was in that blizzard, the kind who won't quit, who won't accept defeat, who will do whatever it takes to bring his brothers home." Finally, Private Jenkins approached the microphone. His shoulder was completely healed now, and he moved with the ease of someone restored to full function. But his eyes carried depth that hadn't been there before, the weight of understanding mortality. "I was there," Jenkins said. "I wasn't the one being carried. I was the support personnel who helped carry them. And I want to be clear about something. What Sergeant Chen did wasn't some superhuman feat. It was a choice. A repeated choice every 100 meters, every hour, every time she wanted to give up and sleep in the snow. She chose to keep moving. She chose to keep her patients alive. She chose to refuse defeat." Jenkins paused, looking directly at Sarah. "And that choice infected all of us. I didn't want to give up because she wasn't giving up. Thompson didn't want to die because she was fighting for him. Rodriguez and Martinez didn't surrender to shock because they could feel her will to keep them alive. Leadership isn't about rank or medals. It's about someone standing in the storm and refusing to let you surrender." The ceremony concluded with Sarah being formally presented with her commendation from the general. She accepted it with minimal fanfare, though the auditorium gave her a standing ovation. What nobody announced that day was Sarah's new assignment. She had been selected to establish and head the Army's new Advanced Combat Medic Training Program, a position that would allow her to share everything she'd learned with the next generation of soldiers who would face impossible circumstances. The Army recognized that medics like Sarah didn't just happen. They were trained, tested, pushed past their limits, until they understood that human endurance transcends physical capability. 3 months later, Sarah stood in the Panjshir Valley, retracing the path she'd walked in a blizzard. The weather was clear and cold but manageable. The mountains were beautiful in their stark way, snow-capped and ancient and completely indifferent to human suffering. She walked to the research station first. It looked smaller than it had in the darkness and blizzard. The fire she'd built was long since cold. The radio she'd used to call for rescue was gone, salvaged, or discarded. The stretchers she'd fashioned from paracord had been left behind as equipment, and Sarah found one still there, weathered but intact. She thought about that night, the desperation, the cold, the moment-to-moment calculation of whether her patients would live or die. She thought about Martinez's wife Maria, about Rodriguez's determination to live differently, about Thompson's choice to stay in the army, about Jenkins' understanding that leadership transcends rank. Then she walked further up the mountain, toward the location where the ambush had happened. The shells had been cleared away. The blood had been washed clean by rain and snow. The mountain had healed itself in the months since the crisis. Sarah sat on a rock overlooking the valley and allowed herself to process what had happened. Not the heroism. She still couldn't accept that framing. But the choice. The repeated choice to move forward rather than surrender. The understanding that her soldiers' lives depended on her refusal to accept defeat. She thought about the soldiers in her training program now, young men and women learning to become combat medics, learning that their responsibility extended beyond bandages and medications. They were learning to be leaders in the moment of crisis. They were learning that when everything else failed, they would be the difference between life and death. And they would carry that knowledge forward, teaching the next generation, passing on what Sarah had learned in a blizzard with 4 dying soldiers depending on her will to survive. That was legacy, not medals or recognition, but the multiplication of commitment, the spreading of understanding about what humans could accomplish when they refused to quit. Sarah stood up and looked back at the valley one more time. Somewhere out there, Rodriguez was starting college. Martinez was breathing easier with his surviving lung. Thompson was leading a new Rangers team. Jenkins was beginning his officer training. And she was here, on the mountain that had nearly killed her, understanding that it hadn't, that she'd walked out of the blizzard, that her soldiers had lived. She pulled out her phone and called her training program coordinator. "I'm ready to come back," she said. "I want to teach the next class about what happens when everything fails and you have to rely on pure will to survive. We'll use the lessons from the blizzard." As she walked back down the mountain toward the helicopters waiting in the valley, Sarah understood something fundamental about herself. She wasn't a hero because she'd saved 4 Rangers in a blizzard. She was a medic because she'd made a choice and kept making it, every step of the way. And that choice, repeated and shared and passed forward, was the only legacy that mattered.